For centuries, one question has haunted the corridors of history. A question that touches not only science, but pride, identity, and the deep need to know where we come from. Who were the ancient Egyptians? Were they Africans, Mediterraneans, Middle Easterners, or a unique blend unlike any other civilization? It's a question that has sparked heated debate, from university halls to YouTube comment sections, and fueled endless arguments across continents. The ancient civilization of Egypt rose on the banks of the Nile more than 5,000 years ago, building monuments that defy time and pyramids that whisper to the stars. But while the stones of Egypt speak of gods and glory, they remain silent on one of the most human questions of all. What race were the people who built them? This debate didn't start in ancient times. It began much later, when Europe rediscovered Egypt and colonial-era scholars projected their own racial ideas onto its ancient past. Some saw Egypt as proof of a Mediterranean cradle of civilization, distancing it from Africa. Others, particularly in the 20th century, fought back, reclaiming Egypt as a distinctly African civilization born from the heart of the continent. And as this tug-of-war raged, the truth lay buried, not just in the sands of the Nile Valley, but in the very bones of those who once ruled it. Now, for the first time in human history, we have a tool capable of unlocking that silence: DNA. And what it reveals may surprise everyone, because it tells a story not of black or white, but of continuity, complexity, and connection. This is the story of what DNA reveals about the true race of ancient Egyptians, and how the mystery, at last, is finally being solved. To understand why this question became so charged, we must first travel back to the 19th century, the golden age of archaeology and the dark age of racial theory. When European explorers and scholars first entered Egypt, they were dazzled. The monuments were older than Greece, grander than Rome, and undeniably African in geography. Yet many couldn't accept that such sophistication had risen from Africa. Figures like Jean-François Champollion, the man who decoded the Rosetta Stone, admired Egyptian genius, but subtly placed it in a Mediterranean context. Others, like Samuel Morton and Flinders Petrie, collected skulls and measurements, attempting to classify Egyptians by race, a reflection of the pseudoscientific obsession with racial hierarchies at the time. Their conclusions were predictably shaped by their era. They imagined Egypt as a civilized outpost of a whiter or Asiatic population that had somehow appeared in Africa. But African scholars told another story. Writers like Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Abanga in the mid-20th century argued passionately that Egypt was fundamentally African, linguistically, culturally, and genetically connected to the rest of the continent. They pointed to linguistic ties between ancient Egyptian and African languages, to similarities in art, symbolism, and spirituality, and to the geographic reality that Egypt sits on the African continent, not outside it. These two competing visions, one Eurocentric, one Afrocentric, defined decades of debate. Yet both were based largely on interpretation, not data. The true answer required something that neither 19th century skull measurements nor 20th century political theory could offer: genetic proof. And so, when DNA technology matured in the late 20th and early 21st century, scientists turned their microscopes toward the mummies themselves. Before we reach the age of DNA, it's worth asking, what did the ancient Egyptians say about themselves? On temple walls, tomb paintings, and papyrus scrolls, the Egyptians left behind thousands of depictions of their people. Men were often painted with reddish-brown skin, women with lighter tones, and neighboring peoples were depicted with distinct colors: black for Nubians, pale yellow for Asiatics, and pale for Libyans. But interpreting these colors as literal skin tones misses the point. Egyptian art was symbolic. Each hue reflected social and cosmic order more than pigmentation. Red-brown represented vitality and life, the color of the fertile Nile mud, while lighter shades represented femininity and purity. The Egyptians themselves called their land kemet, meaning the black land, a reference not to skin, but to the dark, rich soil of the Nile Valley, contrasted with the Deshret, the red desert. Yet some scholars note that kemet may also have carried a double meaning, subtly connecting people and land. Linguistically, Egyptian belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, sharing roots with Semitic and Berber tongues, as well as with some East African languages. This, too, points to Egypt's location at the crossroads of Africa and the Near East, a place of migration, mixing, and cultural synthesis. Even the mummies themselves show variation. Royal mummies like Ramses II or Seti I had features that reflect both Northeast African and Mediterranean traits: broad noses, high cheekbones, full lips. Others appear narrower or more Levantine. In short, ancient Egypt was not a monolith. It was a melting pot before the term existed, a civilization nourished by African soil, but open to its neighbors from the Sinai and beyond. Still, those were artistic clues. To know for sure, scientists needed to reach beneath the paint, to the cells themselves. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers attempted to extract DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies, but with little success. The heat and humidity of Egypt, combined with centuries of handling, meant most genetic material was degraded beyond recognition. Early studies often produced contaminated results or inconclusive data. It wasn't until the rise of next-generation sequencing technology in the 2010s that the dream became reality. In 2017, a team from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History and the University of Tübingen made a breakthrough. They analyzed over 150 mummies from a site called Abusir El Melek, about 100 kilometers south of Cairo. From these, they successfully sequenced DNA from 90 individuals, with full genome data from 3 of them, spanning from the New Kingdom around 1400 BCE to the Roman period around 400 CE. Their results sent shockwaves through academia and the internet. The Abusir mummies showed closer genetic affinity to ancient and modern populations of the Levant and Anatolia, regions corresponding roughly to today's Israel, Lebanon, and Turkey, than to modern sub-Saharan Africans. At first glance, this seemed to confirm an old narrative that the ancient Egyptians were more Middle Eastern than African, but scientists urged caution. For one, the sample came from a single site in northern Egypt during periods of heavy foreign rule, including the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. In other words, the Abusir mummies represent a cosmopolitan population, not necessarily the genetic core of pharaonic Egypt. Second, DNA from southern Egypt and Nubia, regions closer to the source of the Nile, was not included. Archaeological and linguistic evidence shows these southern regions played a critical role in Egypt's formation. Finally, when compared with modern Egyptians, the ancient DNA was actually less mixed. Modern Egyptians show roughly 8 to 15% sub-Saharan ancestry, suggesting increased contact and migration over the past 1,500 years, not less. So what did the data truly say? That ancient Egyptians were genetically distinct, sharing ties to both North Africa and the Near East, but remaining a stable, unique population for thousands of years? In other words, Egypt was neither purely African nor purely Asian. It was, and remains, a genetic bridge between continents. Subsequent studies have added more layers to the story. When DNA from ancient Nubians and other African populations was compared to Egyptian samples, scientists found evidence of deep time connections, shared ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Nile, after all, was a corridor of life, connecting Central and East Africa to the Mediterranean. Populations moved north and south along it for millennia. Early Egyptian civilization likely drew from Nubian and East African genetic pools, as well as from Levantine farmers who migrated during the Neolithic. These early farming communities settled in the Nile Valley, intermingling with indigenous hunter-gatherers who had lived there for thousands of years. So by the time of the pharaohs, Egypt's population already reflected a complex mosaic of African and Near Eastern ancestry, not as separate races, but as converging threads in one long human story. Further genetic research, including mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers, and Y chromosome analysis passed through fathers, shows continuity within Egypt's gene pool over millennia. The people who live in Egypt today are overwhelmingly descended from those who lived there in ancient times, despite waves of conquest, migration, and empire. In simple terms, modern Egyptians are the heirs of ancient Egyptians. Their DNA carries echoes of Africa and Asia, blended uniquely by geography, time, and history. This view aligns with archaeology too. The earliest kings of Upper Egypt came from the south, near Nubia. Early art and burial customs in this region show strong African cultural connections. But as the Egyptian state expanded northward, it incorporated influences from the Mediterranean and Levant. Thus, Egypt was born of two worlds, and that dual heritage is its defining feature, not a contradiction. But there's a danger in letting DNA tell the whole story. Genes can tell us where our ancestors came from, but not who we were as people. They can measure migrations, not meanings. To the ancient Egyptians, identity wasn't about color or race. It was about belonging to the Nile, to the gods, to the cosmic order known as Mot. They defined themselves through their language, rituals, and land, not through appearance. Even foreigners who adopted Egyptian customs were often considered Egyptians, as shown by Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, who ruled as restorers of Egypt's glory, not outsiders. DNA cannot measure the sacred geometry of a pyramid or the poetic rhythm of hieroglyphs. It cannot weigh the myth of Osiris or the devotion that built temples to eternity. So while science answers the biological question, the Egyptians were a genetically mixed but stable African Near Eastern population. It cannot capture the soul of Egypt. That lies in their art, their wisdom, and their enduring idea of civilization. And so, after centuries of debate, DNA has given us an answer, though not the simple one some expected. The ancient Egyptians were neither a lost white race, nor a purely sub-Saharan people. They were the children of Africa and the ancient Near East, a fusion born of the Nile's eternal current. Their civilization, like their genes, flowed between worlds. It absorbed, transformed, and unified. And that, perhaps, is Egypt's greatest secret, that it stood at the meeting point of humanity itself. When we look into the faces of their mummies or read the lines of their poems, we see the reflection of all who came before us, and all who still seek to understand who we are. In the end, perhaps the true mystery was never who they were, but how their story became ours. Because the story of Egypt is the story of us all, written not in stone or skin, but in the shared code of life itself.